Yes.
What, Alice? Are you sure about that?
Nature.
Are you sure? Come here.
Nature is no longer an
Alice, come here.
Yeah, the
Come here, honey. Alice,
Tap In is all about
tap.
sampling our cat.
What? Today my guest is Alice. How are you, Alice? Alice, do you have something special you'd like to say
Nature
about
is
George
no longer
Bush's,
an idea that's useful to us.
our late president and leader?
Sampling.
Yeah, we all know you voted for him twice. Even though he didn't win the next time, it's okay.
How do you feel about dubstep?
Well, hey, Michael.
Hey.
You know what? I wanted to have like a really smooth intro, but
We don't need to.
yeah, we don't have it. Hello. You've already had a podcast today, so thanks for hanging in there. I guess you've just got more gas in the tank than some of us.
I had 2 mates today.
Yeah, I had a lot of coffee too, but that's the key to any podcast, I hear.
I'm also better than average, I believe, at forgetting that I need to eat.
Oh, goodness.
You know?
Yeah, me too. From a young age. Even lately, I tell my partner, like, not eating's cheaper.
True. At first, right? I think a lot of this is the upfront cost just gets backloaded. That's the thing with self-care, right? Is that if you don't take care of yourself, you end up paying for it later. And it costs more later because life is a pyramid scheme. Like the thermodynamics of the whole situation. I've been thinking a lot lately, and I said this in Future Fossils episode 101, which we recorded earlier today. I've been thinking a lot about how if you try to get out of the situation by sleeping, like if your strategy is to hibernate your way out of a crisis, then the opponent, whatever that is, the situation that is presenting a challenge to you, is learning while you sleep.
Yeah.
You know, it's like
Yeah.
I study while you're out, and so that's not actually effective. Like it seems, it's almost like there's a physical law, that we see at play in evolutionary theory, that you either engage, and transform, or you disengage and just sort of coast to some sort of entropy. It's entropy in both cases, but in one case it's like making this engine, and in another case it's just like falling to pieces.
You're right. Some creatures do benefit, though, from, like, helping by staying out of the way, as it were. That reminds me of, like, relatives on holidays, like how some people just don't seem to be doing much, but other people are doing a lot for a meal or to prepare the house or something like that.
Although in both cases, you'd say, well, both of them are participating in a system. Like, in order to step back and like you were talking about how our friend Kaylee came to your podcast recording earlier, and as soon as she came in, she was like perfectly silent and
Wonderful,
present and listening through that whole thing. And I think, that takes an awareness to sit out.
Yeah, like Vipassana, for example. That's just like silence meditation and or even sensory deprivation experiences. That was something that I've been talking to a bunch of people about, is like, instead of adding to the fire of continued stimulation to ease our anxiety, maybe it's taking away stimulation. Whatever we're looking at right now and whatever we're talking about right now certainly is on like a sort of seesaw fulcrum, right, or an axiom even, in that our actions will affect, and you and I both know that, and maybe that's why both of us seem to be a little proactive in how we approach the world in our daily routine.
You're talking about playing the rests.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Well, you think about like all the forest fires that have been going on lately, and they are because we have. It's like what I was just talking about. Actually, we pushed the upfront cost to our kids.
Yeah.
Like we were like, well, we don't want to deal with forest fires, so we're going to prevent them all. And then like all of this underbrush and like crapwood and pests accumulates, all this stuff, and you end up with much more horrible fires.
Interesting.
I don't know why this is on my mind right now.
Maybe it's because you're tapped into nature consciousness.
Well, I mean, let's question that. All right.
Yeah. Let's.
I don't think that's a helpful model or like framework to work from. I do think it's valuable to look at different models, like different ways of looking at the world.
Yeah.
And like you're talking about, like playing the rest could mean like seeing something from someone else's point of view.
Or trying to.
Yeah, stepping out of yourself and seeing things through the eyes of another.
Yes.
Or the world, not necessarily even. They're not necessarily even looking at you.
By doing things differently, you could go about doing that.
Right. So, So I think that there's value in. I don't know how much value there is in the model of like I am tapping into nature, or like I am over here, nature's over there. And I'm going to somehow, first of all, tap a thing, right? Is like a
whatever could you mean, Michael?
It's funny that this would come up, I guess, but you brought it up. You like tapping a maple tree or whatever for syrup.
Great example.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where I presume the Magic the Gathering tap word came from. I don't know for a fact. But
that would be a really interesting thing to find out.
You're tapping your resources,
Yeah, like it's a figure of speech that's really pretty old.
Right, but I think it must come from the physical action of like tapping, literally tapping the side of a tree with a spike.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, or anything that you could tap.
Which is kind of that same sort of like action. If you think about like the tap symbol from Magic.
Yes.
Has that sort of like, it's got an elbow.
Yeah.
And it's like a swinging elbow into the...
Even though that action or gesture, in a sense, can render you, motionless and, playing the rest, so to say, it's an action that has fed into the pyramid scheme of energy, the trickle-down energy field that everybody feels through, either taking action or experiencing rest. And I mean, the whole thing that I guess you're talking about, that it's this whole music idea of not being the drone in the mantra, but maybe the pause to take the breath in between, and how important that is. But what's the value in knowing this? Like how is knowing the difference between when to take a break and when to really go hard in the paint, as they say, is the awareness, now you've got me thinking, like, is the awareness of that in essence like our being aware of nature and not actually like leaving the garden of nature, so to say, that we're tapping in and that we're not already? Is that...
Yeah. I think the idea that nature is no longer an idea that is useful to us,
You'll have to explain that because out of context, that sounds.
Out of context, it sounds pretty bad. Right? Yeah.
That's why I love these podcasts though, because we say ridiculous stuff.
Oh yeah,
It needs
and
explanation.
I would not be surprised if that soundbite ended up in a fugue track. I was like, son of a bitch. Nature is no longer an idea that is useful to us. Son of a bitch.
Or that one.
But
or this one.
Yeah. Exactly. But as an aside, my friend Michelle Shevin, who is on episode 101 of Future Fossils, was talking about, the leaving pieces, like if culture is about just making out of what is around.
Yeah.
Then and then everyone's coming up into it themselves, which is why as a society, as a civilization, we're constantly rediscovering shit. We'll make the same scientific discoveries over and over and over, and people discover that other people have discovered them, sometimes decades or even centuries apart. It's very strange and discoordinated, and there isn't uncoordinated. Never was. It's becoming more coordinated.
You're so right.
It's becoming more coordinated, I think, in that as we start to realize we start to compare the conditions of the birth of a particular idea as it occurred in different simultaneous inventions, we will find that there are similarities, and we will begin to understand from a venture capital sense, not only what we can do to sort of encourage invention, but also we will start to notice the signs. Can you imagine an augmented reality in 10 years? If you're looking around, you look outside and you can actually see you look on a map and you can see a light bulb go on over the head of a city right before a bunch of patents get filed. Right before the ideas actually happen.
What would the symbol be for when the patents expire? Because that would have to be the other side of the app.
Oh, like a puff ball, like a mushroom, that just and then it's been released to the commons. It's yours now.
Yeah, well, I could imagine that actually, and we were talking about how, Boulder, Colorado, at first was a culture that wasn't, in a sense, fitted for a large insurgence of live painting, but it transformed simply through the energy of people in that area. It kind of relates back to what I wanted to talk to earlier about integrating techniques, and how this invention idea. What's interesting about inventions, and I haven't talked about this on the podcast before, but is that you can imagine kind of what it's like to invent something. We just had really quite a big idea about third-person view of a net of ideas being created, and I imagine that there are facilities somewhere that can manage this sort of thing. But I found out today that
maybe they're doing it at the Utah Data Center. Maybe they already can tell. Anyway, go on, sorry.
Well, this is actually interesting because my aunt, she's a very high-tech person, but she's beginning to work with all the different branches of the federal government to integrate their systems, because they're all on different networks and have not up until this point been able to fully integrate with one another to communicate at the what I call science fiction speed.
Yeah.
Which is the cusp of what we can imagine communication to be. But this idea of invention, how can we apply the technique of inventing for ourselves, from one inventor to another, to instances where we're feeling, and this is, to really just bring it back down to earth to the individual, when we're feeling really compressed or, frankly stressed or affected, for lack of a better word. Because I know that as creative as I can be, I know I can also be pretty uncreatively sour at times, just because of personal bullshit.
You mean you don't regard your own psychology as a creative medium in the way that you regard a painting? Perhaps? Like that you're not... Okay, so my friend Lisa Wimberger has this term neurosculpting. She founded the Neurosculpting Institute in Colorado.
Yeah, that's like cognitive behavior and stuff, I imagine.
Well, I mean, a lot of it is like actually attention work. You know, one form or another of attending to different experiences. A lot of them are like in the body, some are visualizations. And I guess like what you're saying that you have trouble like transferring your artistic techniques to your own like inner life?
You got it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Absolutely, because I know like in the poetic sense of life, like, and I've said it before, like our lives are like in a sense an art that we can work towards beautifying, and I guess that's part of the point of this podcast is that like there's got to be a way to like logically conclude that that kind of behavior in a given instance is cool, right?
I mean, you're just talking about like what we know that you learn something before you grok it, right?
yeah.
That it takes a while for a new concept to
grokking
like really root itself in the body. You know, or for like something that your body is doing, I guess could go like probably, I can't think of an example.
Well, that's a really good metaphor actually, is that like, well, you know, like taking root, you know, like ideas certainly have to seed and grow. That's the idea behind any inception, is that like, you know, whether it's from an outside source or, you know, planted there by Leonardo DiCaprio, it needs to grow somewhere. And how frequently does it seem like we don't actually tune into our understanding of the possibilities of the outcomes that we've imagined? You know, like, I'll put it very artistically in that you can have the vision, but we were speaking about how a lot of times it takes 3 to 4 tries to really nail the masterpiece as you've envisioned it.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's just work, right? That's just like how I would work on myself.
I mean, in that case, you know, you might almost say that, you know, there's a thing between like repetition and that's a little different. That's like a hill climbing algorithm. So you're in that case, you're talking, I think, about, you know, repeating a painting, refining it, painting the same thing over and over.
Yeah.
You know, that's you're feeding back the lesson into itself. You know, which is like a deep dream, the Google machine learning algorithm is like taking it's got like a recycling kind of a deal where it's
that feedback.
It's layers. It's based on actual brain architecture. Like you've got like these like they're layers of neurons, and so it filters through, and each one like informs the next. But it's like towards a particular goal.
Yeah. Okay. I see what you mean.
Whereas I think there's another axis upon which to consider this, where that kind of activity doesn't necessarily guarantee integration. It integrates within itself, but it doesn't necessarily become like the basis of like a generalization upon which the rest of your experience in other areas of your life is then based.
Yeah.
You know, like you can do that and you can integrate and iterate within a single idea, and then you fucking nail it every time.
Right.
You know, but you haven't, because you've gotten better at recognizing your own awareness of the ever shrinking like error margin becomes greater.
Yes.
You know, so like that sort of reaches its own diminishing return. Like like the Zeno's paradox, you never quite get there, and it works like Zeno's paradox because unlike material reality, like your
it's like
sort of awareness of the error can, it does actually double as the error margin. At any rate, whereas the actual like integration of an idea is where you can like dance that idea for someone and they'll get it.
There you go. And that's one of those things where like you might not even grok it until you've danced it. That's that idea that professors talk about, how like there's some things you just don't get till you try to teach people or pretend like you're teaching somebody.
I mean, there's no real getting anything. Right. There's no like you.
Yeah, I like that. Okay.
At best, we have a really, really effective model or set of models about what's going on that never fail us because we never encounter an environment novel enough to challenge them. But that environment is out there somewhere.
Well, that's the psychedelic experience, right?
Yeah, you will, if you look for it, find it. And that gets to like actually what we were talking about.
Oh yeah, totally.
At the sort of accidentally non-recorded first start of this thing. The reason I love Weird Studies podcast is because they talk about they're making a fairly rigorous academic philosophy kind of conversation around standing at the edge of the known and asking if it's the edge of the knowable.
I like that idea. I really like how you're a person who has presented to me the concept that ideas have size.
That they have like a geography.
I want to. Well, it's like some ideas way more than others. I don't know how else to put that. Like I mean, what you're talking about certainly might not weigh as much as the mystery of the chicken and the egg, but it's just like the different sizes of infinities. You know what I mean? How like Aleph Null is like infinities or something like that. What is Aleph Null? I have to like look it up and put it in, but it's not unlike fish in a sea. And I think that the weird science weird studies podcast that you're talking about, I tried looking them up the other day before I came on here because I wanted to get an idea of what you've been listening to, but I typed in weird science, I think.
Yeah, the movie.
Yeah, and I got some weird stuff. I got like a comic book podcast, and I was like, I don't think this is it, but
no, but I should listen. I should investigate the weird science stuff out there because I think that was what when I had Dennis McKenna on Future Fossils. That was that whole episode was just about science getting us to the point where we have to like form new kinds of minds.
Yeah, absolutely.
In order to ask the questions that we have come to.
And it's not unlike the bottom of the ocean or something like that. How it's very unknown, and it's territory that should be explored. Like consciousness. I'm kind of thinking about how there's like, there's like the dark net and the internet, and how like there's just like so much consciousness out there that it's like that's the Alan Watts emptiness stuff. This it's just like there's so much that you kind of just you're either terrified or you're kind of okay with not knowing everything. And this is a good question, but it's like, what's the purpose of intelligence after like is intelligence like happiness?
So I had this. Okay, so that's an odd twist,
right?
Because you had me, and so like what?
Yeah, that was pretty tangential.
Okay.
We can digress back.
But so like listening to you speak, I think the way that I think about this stuff, and this is a sort of new reflective layer for me though, is that the meme is actually the interior, like the mental experience dimension of what you would call like the gene, which is the exterior somatic description piece of it. And that's like a Ken Wilber integral theory kind of thing, except that there's like handles in popular language. Like the meme is actually a unit of evolutionary selection at one level, and it does have a body, but it's at a different level of magnification than the gene. The gene is the body of what we call the gene is the body of a thing that also has some sort of rudimentary mindedness.
Yeah.
And what we call a meme is actually like the inside, the interior of something that does have a body, but we don't recognize that because we don't think about ideas as the electrical patterns occurring in, as what, like, okay, Timothy Morton calls it a hyperobject. It's like,
Yeah, okay.
It's like, if you imagine like the idea of God right now, you're looking down at Earth from space.
Or something like that.
You can see, you have crazy alien eyes, and you can see everybody, you can like brain scan everyone in the world at the same time. And you can see everyone who's thinking about God and the pattern that is like a fingerprint that their brain makes, the brain scan, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Thinking about God. And then like those things, those electrical fields are in resonance with and form causal relationships, behavioral causal relationships. Everyone holding that idea, it like drives that person down a particular path of opportunity, and like action is everyone's a little different,
Including their mindset.
right?
And the ideas
So
they get.
all of that stuff is in some sense like the body of the idea of God.
That's kind of like the word in, which, you know, it's not the soul, it's a little different, but it's like this concept that thoughts might be, in a sense, a thing. That's outside of, to be more specific than a thing, like a hyperbody or something like that.
They're realer than we are in that sense, because it's like
yeah,
it was like
ew.
Futurama. Well, like Futurama was talking about
The beast with a billion backs or something.
well,
like
no,
that.
was it I feel like, unless I'm just nuts, I feel like there was an episode of Futurama where Fry was talking about how Batman is more real than you or I, because like he's like, as a fictional character, there's like so many instances of this thing in culture. It's generated so many action figures. Like there's like millions of Batman action figures in landfills and shit.
That sounds like Fry.
You know, and I'm elaborating, but like that there was there's an argument that the body of Batman is like millions of tons of merchandise and film props and
Oh my gosh.
actual actors that played Batman alive. That like all of these things come together are like Batman, you know?
Yeah, conceptually.
Yeah.
And this
And
is
it's gonna
like
live way longer than any of us. Like
Yeah.
Batman is a hyperobject. Every idea is one. And so those are like gods.
yes,
Right?
yes.
And like it
yes.
all makes sense. Like the way the ancient people thought about this shit. It's like, okay, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, clearly the mimetic activity of the world has increased just through sheer social interaction and the paradigm of energy dispersal throughout the universe. In a financial setting, it just it seems to fail, but there has to be like a sort of referential application for these kinds of concepts, because it becomes scary, because it's like, when you begin to dissect consciousness and language like this, it becomes very impersonal. You know, you start to feel like what we could imagine Jim Carrey might feel like, and like, oh, I don't believe in free will. You know, like, oh, you know, it's not like, sure, we're here, and even we're here physically, and our ideas come from this place that we can agree definitely have some sort of metric value, maybe eventually. You know, hopefully America shares this value, please, for once, and maybe that'll be the turning point, is that we have a metric scale, like you're speaking of, like an application for invention, and we can metrically gauge the ideas that a person could have or not. But that sounds like a Stanley Kubrick film, to be honest. You know, like a brain test that just like chooses what you're good for. Oh, like Blindsided. You know, like we've got vampires, and they're clearly more intelligent than humans, such that we have them running everything that needs a smart person doing the good thought thinking. You know, but these.
Well, okay, so like just to clarify for listeners, Blind Sight by Peter Watts, this novel that I've been talking about constantly lately because it blew my mind. Eric Davis recommended it to me.
Who's the author?
Peter Watts. Blind Sight is a novel, a hard science fiction taking place about 100 years from now, in which we paleogeneticists, LOL, have
made that
brought
word for you.
vampires back from extinction because we found enough evidence of their DNA just somehow that we were able to sort of reconstruct them using the best of our knowledge and also like artificial intelligences. So we basically recreate the vampire, and we do so because they were our predators in the Pleistocene, and they were so much smarter than us, but they had a crucifix glitch where they couldn't look at crosses, so we were able to kill them, and then they drifted into myth, right? And superstition, and it was like a creature, you know, maybe. But like the premise being that like we get to a point where our AI becomes so advanced that people are like, it's their job to kill like potential blooms of sentience on the internet so that it's not, it doesn't like disrupt the world economy. And so they resurrect the vampires to become like monster hunters, basically. And it makes a lot of sense. It's like, I think that it's an analogy for how that's what's going to happen. That's what's already happening. We already have competing branches of AI evolution, and there's already this obvious, sorry folks, totally inevitable arms race between different forms of advanced AI that are, I mean, people were writing about this shit in the 1950s. Like we've seen this coming for a while.
This was the concern with computers since the beginning of computers, because there was always like a neurotic egomaniac who could not accept that this computer was smarter than him and that someone else made it. They were like, no, impossible.
But now we've got, you know, the most, I find this really interesting, that the most effective chess player in the world right now, chess players, like the best performing chess masters are no longer a person.
Oh, same with Go.
Well, no. Nor are they a computer.
What?
Either on their own is not enough. The best chess players in the world are groups of people and different machine learning algorithms that have different, like, potentially different outputs regarding the decision of the game. So what happens is, like, you form ensembles of individuals. It become like multicellular life form, which is what they call a centaur in the chess master world. Yeah. So a centaur is like people plus computers.
Yeah, I was thinking about that when I was watching that Go documentary about how the world's best Go player like was playing AI and lost 3-2 or something. But halfway through it, I was like, "This is really interesting." But there's a team of 14 people in another room. Like made this computer. It's like it's this one guy versus all of them, which is basically what you're saying, right? But now it's like they're pitting off entire teams, and it's battle bots, but chess.
Well, it's true that the computer is itself a form of like condensed sentience from all the designers, the people that made it. But that's it's not true that every design is smarter than the team that made it. Like there are forms of synergy where like people come together and create something greater than themselves as a team. But then we all know that there are anti-synergies where like people come together and you just can't even have a conversation because those people are shitheads or whatever. And it's like it's just oil and water type situations where you don't get anything done.
Like a Clockwork Orange.
Yeah, we're like, just like that's why people have to pick their teams carefully because there is a difference. But it's true at every level of organization. That there are synergistic and anti-synergistic interactions in ecosystems all over, and you can quantify that by looking at the energy transfers. Because like there's the vice president of science at Santa Fe Institute, Jennifer Dunn, studies trophic networks.
A trophic?
Which is like all the animals that are eating or it's the predator-prey and symbiotic relationships.
Oh, okay.
Energy transfer relationships in an ecosystem.
Oh, cool.
And she forms these crazy three-dimensional computer objects where each different type of organism in an ecosystem is represented by the node, and then the ball and stick, and then the sticks are their relationships, and it's all color-coded according to what the types of relationships and what the roles are. Whoa. And it looks like this
it's like a conspiracy map, right?
It's like a rainbow basket sandwich looking thing.
My favorite.
And every ecosystem has a relatively similar looking one, which is the most interesting thing. Like an ocean, it turns out, on the level of like the kinds of relationships that the animals are having with each other and other non-animals, looks a lot like a rainforest, even though the percentages and the body types and everything are totally different. That there's a certain way that energy has to flow through a system such that it creates these sort of similar patterns over and over and over. So you have phytoplankton in the ocean and you have trees in the forest, which creates a completely different setup at the level of like the human observer, because you don't have like a forest. You don't have like a three-dimensional structure with which things are organizing themselves in that way in the ocean. The light column just proceeds gradually rather than getting stuck in the canopy and then there being a hard limit at the ground. And so it's a totally different organization in that sense. But the way that it's almost like a forest is just like a squished ocean.
Yeah.
And so it behaves very differently. It's been like squished into a solid form of the sort of same trophic relationships going on in the ocean.
Makes sense though. It's all underwater, compressed and spaced out. There's more room, technically. But the interesting thing about having maps like that is it alludes to the idea that, as you say, the map varies from one ecosystem to the other, but the bigger idea and the bigger picture there would be like how Earth's an ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And how the closer we get to, having this concept of tapping in, it's not like an action, tapping into nature, or more or less understanding the bigger picture of each individual ecosystem, and how like it does create this big beautiful thing called Earth. These bigger picture ideas can oftentimes be what help the individual who's within the condition of their environment mentally transport out of that situation and into this a flow state, more or less, because somehow, not unlike when your DNA is activating and releasing information, which seems to be like a pretty crucial part of DNA's existence, when our person is, or our person, the self is revealed information, epiphanies, things like that, visions, whether you're in traffic or on the toilet, it can be like a breath of fresh air. Not if you're on the toilet, but dude, I'm just kidding. But you know what I mean? Like, when you realize something, it's like a blanket, and that's why they say that understanding is a luxury. But is understanding not also sometimes the cure for anxiety? I mean, it can definitely add to the pile if you seek the understanding.
That's another dog leg. This sort of gets back to what you were talking about earlier, like in terms of the transfer of knowledge, right? In terms of, or not the transfer of knowledge from person to person, but the integration of knowledge into knowing, and knowing into simply doing. Like not having to think about it. And that becoming...
Yeah.
That, and then that coming back up in another way, in the way that you think about something else that you do. So that...
Whatever it is.
So that, like, I guess a concrete example of this, to be fair to people listening, is in my own art, how the idea of being a scientific illustrator has circulated from one medium through other media, and scientific illustration has become this thing that I have, and live painting, I would say, are both like ideas, concepts that were then taken up by my music, such that I started thinking of my music as a form of painting, and also as a form of like rendering an image of a particular thing, like that it was in that sense like a form, like in the sense that visionary art is a form of realism, because you are attempting to accurately, depending on the visionary artist obviously, but like I would say the Alex Gray school, until he went to his like sort of pop icon phase, was very much about that kind of scientific depiction. And he, which I love them both, by the way. I love where he's gone with that stuff. It's
it's just a different decade.
Yeah, totally. Keep rolling, keep moving. But the thing about being honest to the subject with scientific illustration, even as you compress, you reduce data, it's your job. You are the filter, the sieve in that situation, because the photograph is too much in the scientific publications, so you are capturing the salient details and leaving the rest off the page. And I guess it's like you're playing the rests.
Yeah.
And so with music, it comes back into, like, as a looping artist particularly, to listen and to put a layer down, and then to keep listening, and to be endlessly responsive to what's emerging in that moment. Like improv as meditation, but also meditation as a form of scientific investigation where you are, I mean, you're not really testing a hypothesis.
Well, I think for some people, meditating is definitely. I mean, it comes more naturally to some people. Some people are afraid to meditate because the stillness of it all sounds scary.
Well, I guess the null hypothesis is that nothing happens when you sit there and you look.
Yeah.
You know, or like that nothing is going to change if you embark on that form of inner work. And
yeah.
And then the hypothesis being that something will happen.
Well, for me personally, when I meditate, I try to just experience my thoughts and rationalize that experience as happening. And that, accept I've rationalized it, and then it kind of goes forward, and then until the next thought comes into my mind, there is a time, there's like this very blank space where I really am trying to just not have a thought. And then the process of the thought coming and going really feels like the scientific experiment where I'm checking into what it would be like to not be me for a second, in a sense. But that's just going into that layer of the self that could be thought of as like the bigger picture, right? And it doesn't lead to any sense of you're right, like nothing happens, literally.
Like Eric Davis talked about that on Future Fossils. He was talking at the very end of his episode. He brought up the time, no time thing when I asked him about how do you navigate there being, such a complex, information-rich landscape that makes it kind of impossible for us to know what we're looking at, past, present, future.
Yeah.
Like the whole apocryphal William Gibson quote that the future is already here, it's just distributed unevenly, has become a kind of like laughable cliche, like of just like, oh my god, it's just so everything old is new again.
Yeah, exactly. This is what I was talking about earlier, how like knowing is, it releases this sense of epiphany, but is that intelligence happiness? Like, does it really matter? Like, is this like, okay, let me just say, I was gonna ask, like, is this like flood of communication possibility so vast that we don't even know how to really use it, and that there's almost too much at our disposals as the beings who've already made it, and that confusion or lack of understanding of what we've done in terms of like a Pandora's box kind of situation.
When do you think, like, how would you know? Basically, like, everybody talks about the singularity, right?
Oh, yeah.
How would you know?
Yeah,
this is a very important question, because...
Can I give an answer?
Yeah, well, I just want to frame it, though, first.
Please.
Because the most, maybe one of the more important questions in science, as far as I can tell, is how would you know if the singularity happened? Because we're expecting that we're going to be able to identify a bot, like possibly, potentially, maybe even presumably, discarnate intelligence.
Yeah.
Or like intelligence in like the way that I talked about it earlier with like the body of an idea.
Yeah.
Like AI as a somatic thing is a hyperobject. without any question, because it's like it's in computers all over the world, etc. So
Hyper object.
so how would you know? Like you're never gonna you're never gonna notice the beginning of it, because it by its very nature it's distributed relative to our scale, right? So we can't see the beginning of it because wherever it's like it starts everywhere. And so it only becomes more and more obvious as we become more and more aware of being able these like greater patterns.
So this reminds me of something I experienced earlier today when I was picking up some of my paintings from my mother's house, and I saw that there was 2 paintings on the wall. One that was about I want to say like 16 by 12 feet tall, and then diagonal to it on the wall there was one that was maybe about 8 by 8 feet. But then around all of them, my sister had put a giant frame surrounding them on the wall that was about 4 by 4 feet, right? So like they were all in a frame, but like weren't you individually framed.
I like it.
And so what I was gonna say is like singularity. It's interesting to me because it implies a paradigm of non-duality, maybe. Like a complete integration of consciousness and technology. Or maybe there's a better way to explain it, but in the same sense that mythologically, in the situation of enlightenment, which might be quantifiable as the same situation, is explained as the moments before enlightenment, you chop wood and carry water. And what do you do after enlightenment? You chop wood and you carry water. And so there seems to be like this really strange situation where like you can't honestly say that the human mind could know.
Mm-hmm.
Except to the point where one can say, I'm aware of the idea of a fully integrated singularity that's projected onto my consciousness. But the reality of that singularity, I think, really comes down to latency.
Mm-hmm.
And how, if there is a technology that's binding us to the time model of the present, maybe this is where we're getting the ideas of hyperbodies, God, spirits, even demons, like low energy beings that kind of are so dense that they kind of slow time down, and I get nervous even talking about low level stuff. But
I mean, really, it's like there is that sort of notion that there are forms of intelligence that we wouldn't like want to recognize as like alive or whatever. Like it's even simpler than viruses. That the whole point of
That's
like
a
Alan
great point.
Turing talking about the Turing complete sort of algorithm is something that could just sort of execute itself in any medium, in any substrate, and so there could be, for all we know, I don't believe this, I am just making this up on the spot, but there could be, for all we know, patterns in the seismic activity and in the magnetic fields of our planet that were like woven into it by some transcendent AI in order to basically move the crustal plates around
and what's really
by will, to actually like shape the planet. It's conceivable that some intelligence could be great enough to understand magnetic fields and geology enough, and to have the energy at its resources at its disposal,
well, this is
and the lifespan, to do it. But then, like, what kind of entity would that be? Like, to your point of like latency, right?
It'd be the magic of God. Now
Like-
we've arrived at the point where it's like inconceivable technological advancement that's portrayed through reality at a level of hyperbody.
Yeah, so Jeff West, former president of Santa Fe Institute, wrote this book Scale, which I have admittedly not read, but beautifully the core, sort of thesis of this book is that all organisms and organizations occupy this single line along a graph of like, it's the math of how things grow, and sublinear, what they call sublinear and superlinear scaling, so that like a city that is twice as large as another city has 15 times as much innovation, 15 times as much crime and disease. I mean not 15 times, 15% more per capita than a city twice the size. But then also requires 15% less infrastructure. So the animal equivalent is that certain things get more and certain things get less efficient as you move from a mammal the size of a dog to the mammal the size of a horse. The common example is mice and elephants. And how it's like an elephant's heart lasts a lot longer, beats a lot slower. They form more cancers, large animals, like because of the size of the body and like how all this stuff. So like large animals have proportionally more anti-cancer genes than small animals, curiously. But to the kind of thing that would be potent, not necessarily omnipotent, but potent enough to execute that kind of like massive planetary scale project, would have to think so slowly compared to what we are. Like, we're ants compared to a thing like that, right?
Yeah, like...
Or like maybe even like just like germs.
Well, it's funny because people say like, time speeds up as you get older, and it's like, sure. Yeah, I can totally see that, like we just start thinking about bigger shit that's moving through our mind at a wider bandwidth, and then Einstein, he was the guy who tapped into this idea of like the faster you move, the quicker time goes by, right? Or this, which would mean the slower you experience time.
As you approach light speed, time slows to a stop. Yeah.
And that idea of light, I think, is a great model for ideas, and the in the mind, what is light, or in the self, what is lightest is the mind.
Say again?
Within the self, I feel the lightest thing about me is my mind.
Well, what else is in... Okay, so this is just not a map I'm familiar with. What else is
Welcome
in
to
there?
Will's head.
What is it? What else? Okay, so in yourself, there is your mind and your... What?
Body.
Body.
And my body weighs about 150 pounds.
And your mind weighs nothing.
At this point, theoretically, I don't know how I would weigh my mind, but I try to think of it in terms of a model of a vision or a psychedelic experience, even. Or that even people who have experienced being abducted by aliens, I imagine that... Well, or, maybe you've heard the story, a guy smokes DMT, contacts aliens, comes back, tells everybody. You know that guy?
Oh, I've heard that story.
You know that guy too, huh? So, in my opinion, it would seem like if you had to pick up anything to abduct, it would be the mind, right? And that might just be the idea behind brainwashing too, to be honest.
Okay, so in light of the distinctions that I made earlier about, the body and mind of these different scales, So the idea in modern evolutionary biology is that we have multi-level selection.
Yeah.
So it's not just it's not just the selfish gene, right? It's like groups of genes. It's like chromosomes. It's or individual organisms, it's populations of organisms, it's entire ecosystems being selected for. It's the planet in some way being as smart as the cosmos, as its environment,
Yeah.
you know, in order to exist. That, like, if you think of existence as like a computational challenge, which is how, you know, I am learning to see this at SFI, then
Yeah.
you and how, you know, I read a lot about this stuff in the years, you know, before. Like Frank Vertisek Jr. wrote this book Global Brain, where he was actually the one that introduced me to this idea that the Earth is competing against the solar system, basically, in the way that a single and I'm not quoting him on this. This is my own thing, but like the way it's just like endosymbiosis with like the bacteria that lived inside the bacteria that now form the complex cells that we're made out of, and how each cell is actually this whole community of different things, you know, and
even the body is
right.
that.
So that's like a little, you know, in a sense, that's kind of like it's not exactly a little solar system. It's a very different deal, right? But the question of like it doesn't seem the same. We look at a solar system and it doesn't look organized the way a cell looks organized, or even the way that an atom looks organized. And these are issues of scale, but you do see, like, it for the same reason that, you know, you see these consistencies in like animal bodies and so on. You know, you can see these things you can identify the common laws at work, anyway. Little burnout on epiphanies, I guess.
Oh, dude, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying, though. Is like, epiphanies, you know, what are they good for? You know?
Well, they do have to result in something, right?
Yeah, you're right. But, I mean, coincidentally, we've pretty much passed an hour. I'm not kidding. Like, we're pretty much right
You're not
there.
putting your feet on the ground, kid.
Michael, thank you for being on my podcast, dude.
Yeah, man.
Your podcast was one of the ones that really inspired me to get a microphone and start talking about stuff I felt strongly about. I know the university, or the institution, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're lucky to have you, man.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for talking. We got pretty far out, you know. And I think that it's good, though. You know, consciousness is expanding like a breath, you know, and we have to play the rests and go back into our exhale, and, you know, take it all in again. And this is our hope, you know. This is the idea of your podcast, Future Fossils, is to really think in the non-linear way, you know, go into the hyper bodies and, you know, talk them down into the daisy chain of the microphone. You know, we'll flow it all into the microphone. That daisy chain, whatever. I think a good question that everybody would like to know, or would like to ask, rather, is not if there's hope for humanity, but what that hope is.
What is the hope for humanity?
Yes. Or part of it.
Hope is the hope for humanity? Because
Wonderful.
the mouse that despairs in the bucket drowns, and the mouse that keeps swimming eventually gets fished out by the scientists.
That's perfect.
Like that's the depression studies, you know.
Yeah.
So
Oh, dude, thank you for saying that. I needed to hear it. I've personally been grieving a lot lately. And, but I just keep doing the podcast. It might not be healthy.
No, stay hopeful.
Yeah.
That's how I would choose to end this.
Dude, thank you. That is a great bit of advice on so many levels. All right, we'll catch you next time. Tap in podcast.